Dawn in the Great Basin desert arrives quietly. Cold light spreads across the pale silver ground of Nevada long before the sun fully rises. The land looks almost colorless at first, as if the night has not quite decided to leave. Wind moves slowly through the low sagebrush and the scattered desert cactus that cling to the dry soil. A narrow road of red dust cuts across the basin and leads toward a small place called Elk Creek. It is not much of a town, a wooden way station with a few rooms above a saloon, a corral behind it where tired horses stand in the morning frost, a lantern glowing yellow in the window long before the door opens. Travelers pass through on their way to somewhere else and rarely stay longer than they must. Beyond it, the Great Basin stretches farther than the eye can follow. At sunset, the distant rock formations turn deep red, then copper, and finally dark purple as the shadows grow long across the valley floor. At night, the sky opens wide with stars so clear that the desert seems to breathe beneath them. It is a place where very little is hidden. Wind leaves its marks on the earth. Hoof prints last for miles. Smoke from a campfire can be seen hours away, and sometimes a single moment in a place that open can change the direction of a life. That moment began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun hung high above the basin when the gunshot echoed between the rocks. One shot, sharp enough to carry across the empty land. There was no town close enough to hear it, no travelers on the road, no witnesses standing nearby. Only 2 people heard that sound. One person pulled the trigger. The other person was still alive because of it. Delia Marsh had spent most of her adult life working alone in landscapes like this. At 29, she already knew the weight of geological tools slung across a saddle, the careful balance required to climb loose stone, and the quiet patience it took to read the language written in layers of rock. She was not a violent woman. In truth, the pistol in her saddlebag had not been fired in 4 years. Until that afternoon, when Delia found the cowboy tied in the dust between 2 rocks, bleeding through the shoulder while 2 men argued over whether to leave him there. She remembered drawing the revolver almost without thinking. She remembered the thunder of the shot, and she remembered the sudden silence afterward as the men fled into the desert. Later, when the danger had passed and the horses were walking slowly toward Elk Creek, Delia realized something strange. Her hand was still trembling, not because she was afraid, because she had just done something that could never be undone, something that had been necessary, something that had been right. And somewhere behind her on that trail rode the man who was alive because of it. Out here in the Great Basin desert, a single moment can change the direction of a life. One decision, one pull of a trigger, and suddenly 2 strangers are tied together by something neither of them expected. But before we ride farther into this story, tell me something. Where are you right now while listening to this story? Are you somewhere quiet tonight, or somewhere that still remembers long roads, desert wind, and days like this? Delia Marsh had learned long ago that the desert did not care about appearances. The Great Basin judged people by simpler rules. Whether you could walk across loose rock without losing your footing, whether you could carry enough water for the distance ahead, whether you understood the sky well enough to know when a storm was coming across the empty miles. At 29, Delia moved through that landscape with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning its language. Her dark brown hair was usually pulled high beneath a weathered hat, more for practicality than style. Strands often escaped the tie by midday, curling slightly from sweat and dust. Her skin had taken on the deep sun-brown tone of someone who spent long days under open sky, mapping outcroppings and studying the shape of ancient stone. Her face held a softness that sometimes surprised people who met her on the trail. Full cheeks, a rounded chin, and a calm mouth that rarely rushed into speech. But her eyes told a different story. They were sharp and focused, the kind of eyes that studied a cliff face the way a reader studies a page of text. Most of the time she listened more than she spoke. Her shoulders were strong from years of hauling equipment across uneven ground. The muscles in her arms carried the quiet strength of someone used to swinging a geological hammer into rock that had not been touched in centuries. Her figure was full and solid, built not by fashion or exercise but by the steady labor of field work. Delia walked the desert the way experienced climbers walk a mountain path, carefully, steadily, without hesitation. Her hands showed the truth of her profession more clearly than anything else. The skin across her palms held faint calluses where tools rested day after day. Those same hands could flip open a small leather notebook in seconds, sketching rock formations and noting mineral seams with quick, practiced writing. Her clothing was built for the same work: a dust-stained work shirt, a weathered coat for cold mornings, sturdy boots thick enough to survive miles of broken stone, and always the heavy satchel of instruments and notebooks that never left her side. Delia had not learned these habits by accident. Her father had been a geologist before her. When she was young, he had taken her into deserts, much like the Great Basin, and shown her how to read the land. He taught her to recognize the tilt of ancient rock layers, and the way dry valleys hinted at hidden water tables, and the patience required to understand a place that revealed its secrets slowly. He also taught her something simpler. "Deserts don't show mercy," he once told her, while they watched a storm cross a distant ridge. "But they are fair. If you respect the land and understand it, it will let you live." When he died 4 years earlier, Delia continued the work alone. She did not abandon the field studies he had started. She finished them. The desert had never frightened her. Solitude had never felt like loneliness. Out there she did not need rescue, approval, or company to prove she belonged. She carried what she needed, knew how to find water and shelter, and trusted her own judgment above anything else. That was the life Delia Marsh had chosen, a life where survival depended on knowledge, patience, and quiet strength. And yet that afternoon, when she saw the wounded cowboy tied between two rocks, all of those years of solitary discipline had collided with a single moment she could never have predicted. For the first time in her life, Delia had fired a gun at another human being, and somewhere in the desert behind them rode the man who was alive because she had. Reed Callaway had spent most of his adult life moving across land that did not belong to him. The Great Basin was full of men like that, cowboys who followed cattle trails through Nevada, Idaho, and Utah, riding from one spread to another depending on the season. They worked hard, earned their pay, and then moved on again before anyone had reason to expect them to stay. Reed had been living that way for 18 years. At 42, he carried the marks of that life in every part of him. He stood just over 6'3", tall enough that most men noticed it the moment he entered a room. But Reed did not carry his height like someone trying to dominate a space. He moved with the quiet balance of a man used to long days in the saddle, conserving energy the way experienced riders always do. His shoulders were wide and powerful from years of handling livestock and repairing broken fencing. His back was thick with the steady strength that comes from lifting feed sacks, hauling gear, and riding hard across rough country. This was not the kind of strength built in a gym. It was the strength of work, repeated every day for decades. His face looked exactly like the desert had shaped it, a square jaw that held firm even when he was tired. High cheekbones sharpened by years under harsh sunlight, a nose that had been broken once, long ago, and healed slightly crooked. The faint lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into bright horizons rather than laughter or comfort. But the most striking thing about Reed Callaway was his eyes, a bright green that seemed almost out of place in a landscape dominated by brown dust and pale stone. When he looked at someone, he did it directly and without hurry, as though he believed the truth of a person could be learned simply by paying attention. Most people were not used to being observed that carefully. His hands matched the rest of him, large, rough, the skin thick with calluses that had built over years of rope work and rains. Even after washing, traces of dust and leather remained along the creases of his palms. His clothes rarely changed. A black cowboy hat that had faded from long exposure to the sun, a coarse work shirt that had been patched more than once, heavy riding boots built for distance, a gun belt resting low on his hips, worn smooth from constant use. Reed spoke very little unless something important needed saying. It was not that he disliked conversation. He simply believed that most talk filled space rather than meaning. Men who rode the open desert alone for long stretches often developed that habit. Silence became comfortable. Observation replaced unnecessary questions. And over the years, Reed had built his life around that same pattern. Work hard, ride on, leave before attachments complicated things. He had never owned land, never stayed long enough in one place for people to ask him to. Not because he lacked loyalty or kindness, but because the open road had always seemed simpler, cleaner. A man could keep his promises easier when they lasted only a season, which was why the events of that afternoon unsettled him more than the bullet wound in his shoulder. Because the moment Delia Marsh fired that shot in the desert, something unusual had happened. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of drifting from place to place, Reed Callaway found himself tied to another person's story, not by choice, not by intention, but by the simple fact that he was alive because she had refused to ride away. And somewhere between the desert trail and the lantern light of Elk Creek, Reed realized that this might be the one kind of debt a man could not repay simply by moving on. Elk Creek was not a place people planned to stay. It existed for travelers crossing the Great Basin who needed water, a meal, or a place to sleep before riding on. The wooden way station sat beside the dusty road with a small stable behind it and a few narrow rooms above the main hall. For most travelers, it was nothing more than a pause between miles. For Delia Marsh and Reed Callaway, it became 3 unexpected days. The doctor in Elk Creek treated Reed's shoulder within an hour of their arrival. The bullet had passed through the upper muscle and missed bone, which the doctor said was fortunate. 3 days, he told Reed firmly. You ride before that, and you'll open the wound again. Reed did not argue. Delia paid for 2 rooms without explaining anything further. The doctor asked no questions. Places like Elk Creek learned long ago that travelers sometimes carried stories they were not ready to tell. That first evening settled quietly over the station. The wind moved through the sagebrush outside while lantern light flickered across the wooden hallway. Delia spent most of the evening alone in her room, studying her notes and trying not to think too carefully about the sound of the gunshot still echoing in her memory. A knock came at her door after dark. When she opened it, Reed stood there holding 2 tin cups of coffee in his left hand. His injured arm was bound tightly against his chest. He did not offer an explanation. He simply handed her one of the cups. Delia stepped aside. They sat near the small window where the desert night spread beyond the glass. Stars filled the Nevada sky so clearly that the darkness seemed almost alive. They did not speak much. Reed asked once if the shaking in her hands had stopped. Delia answered that it had. After that, they mostly sat together in the quiet. The presence of another person did not feel like intrusion. It felt like steadiness. Morning came cold and pale across the basin. On the second day, Delia came downstairs early and found Reed already sitting at one of the wooden tables, with his arm carefully braced against his side. The innkeeper placed breakfast in front of them without comment. Delia spread a large folded map across the table. It showed the geological survey routes she had been following across Nevada. Lines marked outcrops of volcanic rock and mineral seams she had been documenting along the Humboldt region. Reed studied the map for several minutes before speaking. "You work all the way through that basin alone?" "Yes." He nodded slightly. Then he asked another question, not politely, not casually, but with the direct curiosity of someone who actually wanted to understand. "What kind of rock runs along the eastern ridge here?" Delia looked down where his finger rested. "Basalt flows," she explained. "Ancient lava fields that cooled into layered stone. The erosion patterns show where water once cut through the valley thousands of years ago." Reed listened closely. When he asked questions, they were thoughtful ones. He wanted to understand how the land worked, how the rock told the story of time beneath the surface. For Delia, explaining it felt unexpectedly easy. By afternoon, they walked slowly behind the way station while Reed tested his strength. The doctor had warned him not to ride yet, but walking was allowed. They stood beside the corral, watching the sun lower across the basin. Reed spoke then about cattle, about how herds moved differently when water sources shrank, about the way experienced cowboys could read the behavior of animals the same way Delia read stone formations. Neither of them tried to impress the other. They simply talked about the work they knew best. That night, Delia returned to her room with a strange realization. For the first time in years, she found herself hoping the next morning would not come too quickly. On the third day, dawn arrived with the same pale desert light. Delia stepped outside onto the wooden porch before the inn had opened. Reed was already there. He sat on the railing with a cup of coffee resting in his hand, watching the valley brighten as the sun climbed slowly above the distant hills. Delia leaned against the porch post beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They did not need to. Below them, the Great Basin stretched wide and quiet, silver ground slowly warming under the rising sun. The wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush across the empty miles, and somewhere inside those silent minutes, both of them understood something simple. In just 3 days, Two people who had spent most of their lives alone had begun sharing the same rhythm of time. Sometimes that is how connection begins, not through dramatic declarations, but through the quiet discovery that someone else's presence fits naturally inside the shape of your days. Morning on the third day arrived quietly over Elk Creek. The cold air of the Great Basin still lingered from the night, and the first sunlight had only begun to reach the distant rock formations across the valley. From the wooden porch of the way station, the land looked endless, stretching out in pale silver and muted red beneath a sky that was slowly brightening. Delia Marsh stood beside the porch railing with a cup of coffee warming her hands. Reed Callaway leaned against one of the posts nearby. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them had changed over the past 3 days. It no longer felt like the polite silence of strangers sharing the same space. It had grown steadier, like something that had found its place without needing to be announced. Reed was the first to break it. "I've been riding the Great Basin for 18 years, he said. His voice was calm, almost reflective. Never stayed in one place longer than a season. Delia turned her head slightly toward him, but did not interrupt. "That's just how the work goes," he continued. "Cattle move. Contracts change. You ride where the next job is." He paused, watching the light spread slowly across the desert floor. "In all that time," he added, "I never once thought about stopping." The wind stirred across the sagebrush below the porch. Delia understood that this was not casual conversation. Reed rested his coffee cup on the wooden railing. "Until the last 3 days." The sentence landed quietly between them. Delia felt the weight of it immediately. Reed was not a man who spoke carelessly. Every word he chose seemed deliberate, like a rider placing each step carefully across uncertain ground. She looked out over the valley again before answering. "I'm not very good at this kind of conversation either," she said after a moment. Reed glanced at her. "I've spent most of the last few years working alone," she continued. "When something difficult happens, I usually deal with it myself." He nodded once, listening. "When you knocked on my door the first night," she said, "I almost didn't open it." Reed did not look surprised. "But I did," she added quietly. He waited. "Not because it was polite," Delia said. "Because I wanted you to stay." The desert breeze moved softly through the open valley. For a moment, neither of them said anything else. That simple truth had crossed a line neither of them had planned to approach when the gunshot echoed across the basin 3 days earlier. They were no longer just two travelers who had shared an unexpected moment. They had begun to see each other. Not in the casual way people sometimes notice strangers along a road, but in the deeper way that happens when two lives briefly share the same ground. Reed studied the horizon again before speaking. "I'm not a man who makes big promises," he said. "I didn't ask for one," Delia replied. He nodded slightly. The quiet between them remained steady, but something new had settled into it now, something warmer, something harder to ignore, and both of them understood that once two people crossed that invisible line between strangers and something more, the next decision became far more complicated. Because moments like this did not last forever, and sooner or later one of them would have to decide what happened when the road continued. By the afternoon of the third day, the quiet understanding between Delia Marsh and Reed Callaway had settled into something both of them could feel, but neither had tried to name. The desert outside Elk Creek had returned to its usual rhythm. Wind pushed thin lines through the dust along the road. The corral horses shifted slowly in the shade of the wooden fence. Travelers came and went through the station without paying much attention to the two strangers who had spent the past few days sharing the same table and porch. Life in the Great Basin rarely paused for long. Reed's shoulder was healing quickly. The doctor examined the wound again that morning and declared that the muscle had begun to close properly. With care, Reed could ride again by the next day. That meant something neither of them had spoken about directly. Their time in Elk Creek was ending. For Reed, the road would continue east along the cattle routes he had followed for nearly 2 decades. Autumn drives would begin soon across the Nevada ranges, and men like him were always needed to move herds across the dry basin lands. For Delia, the Humboldt survey lines waited farther north. There were rock formations she had not finished mapping, mineral veins still unrecorded in her notebooks, weeks of solitary work ahead across ridges and dry valleys where few travelers ever passed. Their paths had crossed because of one violent afternoon and 3 unexpected days of stillness. But the lives they had built before Elk Creek were shaped by movement and independence. Reed rested his arms along the porch rail that evening as the desert turned red beneath the setting sun. "You know how this usually goes," he said quietly. Delia stood beside him. Yes. The valley darkened slowly beneath the long shadows of evening. "I don't stay anywhere long," Reed continued. "That's never been the kind of life I built." Delia understood that. Men who spent years riding cattle trails often carried a kind of restlessness with them. The open land became familiar in a way that houses and towns rarely could. "And I don't follow people," Delia said calmly. Reed looked toward her. "I figured that." She folded her arms lightly against the porch rail. "I've spent years learning how to live alone in places like this," she added. "It works for me." Neither of them sounded defensive. They were simply acknowledging the truth. What had begun between them during those 3 days was real, but it existed inside a fragile pocket of time that might vanish the moment they rode away from Elk Creek. Neither of them wanted to pretend otherwise. In younger years, people sometimes rushed past those questions with promises made too quickly. But both Delia and Reed had lived long enough to understand something quieter. Real connection did not erase the lives people had already built. And sometimes the most difficult moment was not admitting that something mattered. The harder question was, what happened when 2 independent lives met in a place that offered no easy road forward? The wind swept across the porch, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush. Somewhere out in the basin, a hawk circled high above the valley floor. Reed watched it for a moment before speaking again. "What we found here," he said slowly, "might not exist once we leave." Delia did not argue, because she knew he might be right. The desert was full of brief crossings like this. Travelers shared a campfire or a trail for a few days, and then vanished into different directions, carrying only the memory of the meeting. But sometimes a person could not help wondering what might happen if, just once, someone chose not to ride past the moment. And that question was waiting quietly between them now. Morning on the 3rd day arrived colder than the 2 mornings before it. The Great Basin sky held a pale gray light that slowly softened into silver as the sun climbed behind the distant ridges. Frost clung lightly to the wooden rail outside Elk Creek, and the wind moved through the sagebrush with the slow patience of early autumn. Delia Marsh stepped onto the porch just after dawn. She had slept little, not because anything had gone wrong, but because she understood that by the end of the day the quiet space that had formed between her and Reed Callaway would likely dissolve back into distance. Reed was already there. He stood near the hitching rail beside the porch steps, adjusting the saddle strap on his horse with careful movements. His injured shoulder still limited the motion of his right arm, but the strength in his stance had returned. A man who had spent 18 years riding cattle across open desert did not remain still for long. Delia leaned against the porch post and watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're leaving this morning?" Reed nodded without looking up. "Doctor said I can ride now." The saddle strap tightened beneath his hand. He checked it once more before stepping back from the horse. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It carried the calm understanding of two people who had already said most of what mattered. Reed finally turned toward her. "I ride through the Humboldt Basin every October," he said. Delia listened without interrupting. "There's a stretch east of the main trail," he continued, "where two tall rock formations sit close together." She knew the place immediately. Twin rocks. Surveyors used it as a natural marker for mapping the eastern ridges. "I pass through there most years," Reed said. He did not say anything else, but he did not need to. Delia understood exactly what the words meant. He was not asking her to follow him. He was not asking her to promise anything. He was simply placing a possibility into the open air between them. If she ever happened to be there in October, he might be there too. The invitation carried the quiet respect both of them had shown each other since the beginning. Reed would not ask for more than she freely chose. Delia studied the horizon for a moment before answering. The Great Basin stretched wide and empty beneath the rising sun. Miles of pale earth and scattered rock formations rolled outward in every direction, a place large enough to hold both distance and return. "You're giving me coordinates," she said calmly. Reed allowed the faintest hint of a smile. "Something like that." Delia folded her arms loosely across her chest. In the desert wind, the moment felt strangely balanced. Neither of them was trying to hold the other in place. Neither of them was pretending the road ahead would become simple. But they had both lived long enough to recognize something real when it appeared. And sometimes the quietest kind of invitation carried the most weight. Reed reached for the reins and prepared to mount. For the first time since the gunshot echoed across the basin 3 days earlier, the distance between them was beginning to return. But now that distance held a new possibility, not a promise, just a direction, a place where two separate trails might cross again if both riders chose to arrive there. Reed Callaway rested one hand on the saddle horn, preparing to mount, when Delia Marsh spoke again. "Callaway." He paused and looked toward her. The morning light had begun to spread across the Great Basin, turning the pale ground faintly gold. Wind moved through the sagebrush beyond the road, and the long silence between them carried the calm weight of decisions that had not yet been spoken. "You ride through Humboldt in October," Delia said. Reed nodded once. "Most years." She studied the horizon for a moment before continuing. "I'll be surveying that region around the same time." Reed waited. He did not lean closer. He did not try to guess the rest of her sentence. Men who had spent most of their lives reading weather and cattle learned patience early. Delia turned slightly, so she was facing him fully now. "The eastern ridges there still need proper geological mapping," she said. "I've been planning to return before winter." Her voice remained steady, not hesitant, not rushed. "And I'll be near those rock formations you mentioned." Reed understood the meaning behind the words before she finished speaking. Delia was not someone who followed people across deserts. She had made that clear the evening before, but she was someone who chose her direction carefully, and right now she was choosing it. She looked at him directly. "I'll be there," she said simply. A faint line appeared at the corner of Reed's mouth. "Because of the survey?" he asked quietly. Delia allowed herself the smallest smile. "Because I want to." The wind carried the scent of dry earth across the road. Reed exhaled slowly, as though something he had been holding inside for the past few minutes had finally settled into place. For a man who had spent 18 years riding without stopping, the words meant more than they appeared to on the surface. Delia had not promised anything beyond that meeting, but she had done something far more important. She had chosen not to let the moment vanish without giving it a chance to exist again. Reed swung himself carefully into the saddle. The movement was slower than usual because of his healing shoulder, but he settled easily into place once he was seated. He adjusted the reins and looked down at her. "October," he said. "October," Delia replied. There were no dramatic gestures between them, no long farewell speeches, just the quiet understanding that the next part of their story would depend on whether both of them arrived at the same place again. Reed tipped the brim of his black hat slightly. Then he turned the horse toward the road leading east. The sound of hooves faded slowly across the dusty ground as he rode away from Elk Creek. Delia watched until he became a small shape against the wide horizon. Then she returned inside the station and opened her field notebook. On the page marked Humboldt Basin, she wrote a short note beneath the geological survey coordinates. Twin Rocks, Eastern Ridge, October. She closed the notebook after a moment, not because the note was finished, because the reason for it was already clear. October arrived in the Great Basin with colder mornings and a sky that seemed even wider than it had in summer. The desert had not changed. It was still vast and quiet, still stretched mile after mile beneath a sky so clear that distant ridges appeared almost close enough to touch. The wind still moved through the sagebrush in slow, steady breaths, and the dry earth still held the same pale silver color beneath the Nevada sun. The Great Basin never promised anything to the people who crossed it. No easy roads, no certain water, no guarantee that the next traveler you met would ever appear again. That was the rule of places this wide. Delia Marsh knew that rule well, which was why she arrived at the Twin Rocks 3 days earlier than her survey schedule required. The 2 stone pillars rose from the eastern Humboldt Basin like sentinels that had been standing watch for centuries. Their shadows stretched long across the ground in the early morning light, marking time the way ancient landmarks often did in open country. Delia had camped nearby while continuing her geological notes. She studied rock layers. She recorded mineral deposits. She walked the ridges surrounding the formation exactly as she would have if the meeting in Elk Creek had never happened. But every morning she looked toward the narrow trail that cut across the valley floor. 3 days passed that way. The desert remained quiet, Then on the fourth morning, just after the sun began to lift above the ridge, Delia saw movement on the horizon. A rider. The shape appeared small at first, just another dark figure against the pale land. But as the horse moved closer across the basin, the details became clearer. Black hat, tall frame in the saddle, steady pace. Reed Callaway reached the Twin Rocks exactly on the day he had said he would. Not earlier, not later, just exactly when he promised. He guided the horse to a stop a few yards away and looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved lightly between the two tall rock pillars while the Great Basin stretched silent in every direction. Reed finally stepped down from the saddle. "You got here early," he said. Delia rested one hand on the rock beside her. The terrain needed a closer look. Reed studied the empty campfire ring nearby and the field notes stacked beside her equipment. 3 days' worth of closer look? Delia met his eyes. Something like that. For the first time since they had met, Reed allowed himself a quiet smile. The desert had not changed. It was still wide, still silent, still unwilling to promise anything. But this time, standing between the Twin Rocks beneath the open Nevada sky, Delia Marsh was no longer the only person there, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. Out here in the Great Basin desert, nothing is promised. No shade waiting over the next ridge. No easy road cutting straight across the valley. And no certainty that two lives traveling in different directions will ever cross again. The desert doesn't make those kinds of guarantees. It only offers space, miles of wind, stone, and sky, where people reveal exactly who they are when there is nowhere left to hide. Sometimes two strangers meet in a place that honest. Sometimes a single decision, a single moment, changes the direction of both their lives. And sometimes, if they are willing to return to the same stretch of open land, something real begins there. Before we leave Delia and Reed standing there between the Twin Rocks in the Great Basin, I want to ask you something. Do you believe moments like that really change a life forever? Or do you think most people keep riding past the chances that could have mattered? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every story people share under these videos.